Welcome to True Echo, the channel where real strength echoes louder than the noise, and the underestimated always rise. Today's story is a jaw-dropping tale of humiliation, perseverance, and poetic justice. When a black woman pilot was laughed out of class by arrogant peers and professors, she vanished quietly, only to return with the power to pull every dollar from the program. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay with us to the end, it's a ride you won't forget. From the moment Ava Sinclair stepped into the lecture hall at Westland Aviation Academy, she felt the weight of every stare. They didn't have to say anything at first, their glances were loud enough. Some looked surprised, others amused, but most looked through her like she didn't belong. It wasn't because she lacked credentials, far from it. Ava had a degree in aeronautical engineering, logged more flight hours than some of her instructors, and even flown with a NATO contractor in Afghanistan. But none of that mattered here. What they saw was a black woman in a tailored leather jacket, tight bun, polished boots, and confidence that made them uncomfortable. It wasn't long before the murmurs turned into open mockery. "Guess they're letting everyone in now," one student whispered loudly. "Maybe she thinks this is a fashion runway," chuckled another. Ava didn't flinch. She just took her seat, second row, center, where only the most prepared students dared to sit. The professor, Dr. Gerald Langston, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He began his lecture on flight control systems as though nothing had happened, yet made subtle jokes that seemed to only target Ava. That first week was brutal. Anytime Ava raised her hand, Dr. Langston would skip over her. When she asked about turbine startup sequences, he smirked and said, "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Miss Sinclair. Some of us still need to learn the basics." Laughter echoed around her. But Ava had dealt with far worse: combat zones, emergencies at 30,000 feet, and men who doubted her since her first flight lesson at 16. She absorbed the cruelty like armor, staying late in simulators and acing every test. Still, no one wanted her there. And she could feel it. By week 4, the class had started calling her Captain Affirmative Action. She didn't react, not when they switched her simulator settings mid-test, not when someone tampered with her flight logs, and not when Dr. Langston publicly doubted her license. But the final straw came during a group project presentation. Her teammates, who had done none of the work, rearranged the PowerPoint and made her look incompetent in front of the entire department. When Ava tried to explain, the dean himself interrupted, "Maybe this program is just too intense for your background." That night, Ava walked out of the academy. No dramatic speech. No tears. Just silence. She handed in her badge and student pass, then walked across the airfield one last time. No one stopped her. No one cared. But someone should have. Because Ava Sinclair wasn't just a pilot in training. She was the future owner of the skies. And Westland Aviation had just made a critical error. 2 years passed. Not a word about Ava Sinclair echoed through the polished halls of Westland Aviation Academy. Students graduated. New cadets enrolled. Dr. Langston remained head of instruction, still snide and smug, still tossing casual jabs at diversity hires and quota seats. The memory of Ava's presence had been reduced to a few scattered jokes, the kind shared in whispers behind closed doors. What no one knew was that Ava hadn't disappeared. She'd simply taken off at a higher altitude. After walking out of the academy, Ava returned to Georgia, where her grandmother's home still sat on the edge of a former air base. With money saved from her private contracts and a few discreet military favors, she bought an old hangar outside Atlanta and began something that would soon rewrite her name across every major aviation boardroom in the country. It started small. A few leased twin-engine jets, 2 hand-picked mechanics she'd flown with in Afghanistan, and Aviation, a charter airline focused on emergency services, disaster relief, and underserved regions. Within 6 months, Skybridge Global had contracts with FEMA, the UN, and several government agencies. Her team was sharp, diverse, and loyal. Every one of them had been overlooked by institutions like Westland. Ava's command grew quietly and steadily. While her classmates at Westland were still applying for commercial airline jobs or fighting over internships, she was flying top-secret missions over Haiti, transporting scientists to Arctic research sites, and evacuating refugees in war zones. The industry started whispering her name again, but this time with awe. "Have you heard about that new outfit with the ex-military woman CEO? The black pilot who flies her own fleet." And then came the real power shift. One chilly morning in early December, Ava sat across from a committee of donors and government contractors in Washington, D.C. One of them, an older white man with suspenders and a skeptical glare, leaned back and asked, "Tell me, Miss Sinclair, why should we divert our $72 million aviation grant from Westland Academy to your startup outfit? She didn't blink. Because we've logged 93% mission success in 11 countries, with 0 accidents, while they still allow instructors who can't pass FAA physicals to teach commercial pilot students, Ava replied. The man blinked. By March the money was hers. Ava didn't make a big announcement. No press conference. No gloating. She simply smiled, signed the documents, and watched as 7-figure wires flowed into her company. But one part of the agreement made her pause. Westland's grant was cut entirely. She would now oversee funding allocations to several independent flight schools, and her name would appear on every approval form. It was poetic. But Ava wasn't done. She waited, quietly. And when the spring semester rolled around, she paid a visit. She didn't walk through the front like last time. No. This time, she landed on the Academy's private airstrip in a jet she piloted herself, call sign Skybridge 1. The fuselage gleamed with her logo. A stewardess rolled out a carpet. And Ava stepped down in a navy blue flight suit, tailored with gold trim and a black leather bomber jacket with her call sign stitched in silver, capped, Sinclair. She was no longer asking to be seen. She was there to inspect the school's funding compliance. And her arrival caused a silence deeper than anything the school had heard in years. The parking lot filled with murmurs as faculty and students stared at the aircraft sitting like a hawk on the Westland runway. The jet was sleek, powerful, a machine that didn't just suggest money, it commanded attention. And the woman stepping out of it? She was no longer the cautious, quiet student they dismissed. Ava Sinclair walked with measured grace, flanked by 2 aides in matching Skybridge uniforms. A government liaison trailed her, clipboard in hand, trying to keep up. Her entrance wasn't grandiose. She didn't wave or demand a spotlight, but the silence that followed her boots clicking on the Academy's marble floors was louder than applause. Dr. Langston spotted her first through the glass walls of the faculty wing. He stood frozen mid-sentence in a conversation with the dean. His face fell. Color drained. Is that? He whispered. It can't be, the dean replied, but his voice quivered. Ava entered the main office and smiled politely. Ava Sinclair, here for a scheduled compliance review. Skybridge Global. We're now overseeing allocation on all previously awarded federal aviation training grants. She placed her credentials on the counter. The receptionist, a woman who had once refused to make eye contact with her, looked as if she'd seen a ghost. Within 20 minutes, the entire administrative building knew. Ava had returned. But not as a student. As the woman who held the financial leash on the very institution that had humiliated her. She was escorted to the boardroom, where Dr. Langston and several department heads waited in tight-lipped discomfort. Ava took her seat at the head of the table. Her aides handed out packets detailing federal compliance standards, student diversity reports, instructor evaluations, and aircraft safety inspections. Dr. Langston tried to smile. Captain Sinclair, he said, the words catching in his throat. It's surprising to see you again. You've certainly done well for yourself. Ava didn't smile back. I didn't come for pleasantries, she said coolly. I'm here to assess whether Westland meets the criteria for continued consideration in our funding initiative. This review includes interviews with current students, an audit of simulator performance logs, and a full review of instructor conduct. The dean cleared his throat. We've been having some administrative challenges. A transitional period, really? Ava opened her folder. According to FAA records, 3 of your instructors have failed recertification in the last year. Your last simulator upgrade was 6 years ago. And your student attrition rate for minority applicants is the highest in the state. There was a long pause. She continued, her voice razor-sharp but never loud. You treated me like a novelty. Laughed me out of your halls. But here's the irony. You failed to recognize the very thing you pretend to teach, flight. Not mechanics, not memorization. Flight. The courage to rise while others expect you to fall. Dr. Langston shifted in his seat. Miss Sin, Captain Sinclair, I think we can agree that whatever happened before was unfortunate. Perhaps misinterpreted. She leaned forward slowly. No, it wasn't misinterpreted. It was the culture here. And you made sure of it. Her words were steady, devoid of anger, but carried the weight of every insult, every dismissed hand, every sabotage. For the next hour she conducted the review like a military operation. Professional. Surgical. Unapologetic. When it ended, she rose and said, expect a full report within 7 business days. Depending on what we find, Westland's remaining funding may be redistributed to newer, more inclusive academies. She paused by the door and turned. And just so you're aware, 2 of your cadets applied to Skybridge last week. I've personally approved their scholarship offers. Dr. Langston looked down at the table. The dean closed his eyes. Ava walked out the same way she had 2 years ago. Only this time no one laughed. They stood and watched her rise. By the time Ava returned to her jet, word of her visit had spread across the campus like wildfire. Students who once scoffed at her presence now whispered her name with awe. Phones were out. Videos were being taken. Someone tweeted a blurry photo with the caption, "Remember the black girl they mocked out of Westland? She just landed her own jet and canceled their money." It went viral before she was airborne. But Ava didn't care about the attention. She cared about the legacy. As her jet lifted off the Westland runway, Ava looked down at the shrinking buildings below, the lecture hall where she'd been humiliated, the simulator room she'd been locked out of, the very patch of grass where someone once threw her notebook and said, "Try this on the runway." She didn't feel vengeance. She felt precision. That's what flight taught her. You don't waste energy on turbulence, you adjust, correct, and climb. Back at Skybridge headquarters, the response was explosive. Major news outlets reached out for interviews. Talk shows debated the funding reallocation. But Ava declined most requests. Her focus was now broader. She'd made her point, but the system needed fixing, not just exposing. She launched a new initiative, Aviation program, a national scholarship and mentorship pipeline for underrepresented students pursuing aviation, engineering, and aerospace careers. Within 3 months, over 1,400 applicants flooded the website. Most had stories like hers, ignored, overlooked, underestimated. Skybridge expanded, opening regional training centers in Detroit, Dallas, and Birmingham. One day during a board meeting, her executive assistant rushed in with an envelope. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "It's from Westland." Ava raised an eyebrow. She opened the letter slowly. Inside was a formal invitation. Dr. Langston was retiring. And the Academy Board wanted Ava Sinclair to deliver the keynote address at the graduation ceremony. They'd even added a handwritten note. "You were right. We were wrong. The students deserve to hear your voice." For a moment Ava said nothing. Then she smiled, one of those rare smiles that held both fire and forgiveness. "I'll do it," she said. "But on one condition." And she leaned over to whisper in her assistant's ear. When the graduation day came, Westland's auditorium was packed. Media vans lined the street. Students buzzed, wondering if the rumors were true. And then the doors opened. Ava walked in, not in a business suit, not in designer heels, but in full pilot uniform. Tailored. Commanding. The same one she wore flying across war zones. Behind her walked 12 students from her Aviation program, diverse, sharp-eyed, wearing their own custom blazers with Skybridge emblems. The dean greeted her nervously. "Thank you again for..." Ava cut him off gently. "I'll take it from here." She took the podium. Her voice rang out, clear, poised. "I was told once that I didn't belong here. That I wasn't good enough, fast enough, white enough. I believed it, for a moment. But flight taught me something else. It taught me that the sky doesn't discriminate. Only people do. And when they do, you don't fall. You fly higher." The room was dead silent. Then thunderous applause erupted. Some of the same professors who once ignored her were now standing. The students, especially the women and students of color, had tears in their eyes. But Ava wasn't finished. She gestured to the 12 young people standing behind her. "These," she said, "are the next generation of pilots, engineers, commanders. And unlike me, they won't have to beg to be seen. Because I'm watching now. And I'll make sure they rise." She walked off stage without waiting for applause. Because this wasn't about praise. It was about power reclaimed. As Ava stepped off the stage, her presence left a silence more powerful than any speech ever could. The auditorium buzzed not with noise, but with reverence. Eyes followed her every step. A few professors tried to approach her, some out of guilt, others simply to bask in the glow of her victory, but she offered only polite nods. She wasn't there for them. She was there for the students, especially those who had doubted themselves in the face of subtle sabotage and quiet exclusion. In the back of the room stood Simone Torres, a sophomore whose transfer request had nearly been denied because of academic incompatibility. She watched Ava walk past and whispered to herself, "That's who I want to be." Back at her jet, one of the Skybridge students, Jalen, a quiet 17-year-old who had grown up in foster care, asked Ava, "Captain, were you scared? You know, back when they all turned on you?" Ava didn't answer right away. She climbed the steps of the aircraft, turned back and looked at him. Terrified, she said. But fear's just altitude in disguise. The higher you go, the thinner the air gets. But the view? It's unmatched. As the door closed behind her, Jalen stood a little taller. The weeks that followed were monumental. Ava's elevation program began to attract global attention. NASA sent a delegation. Boeing offered to sponsor a fleet of simulators. Even the Air Force invited her to speak at their Leadership Academy, where they were revamping diversity protocols after a scathing internal report. But one email hit Ava harder than any deal. It was from her father. They hadn't spoken in 5 years. He'd been a crop duster in Alabama, hardworking, proud, and painfully traditional. When Ava had left the military and decided to pursue commercial aviation, he'd called it selling out. He never understood why she wanted to walk into rooms where no one looked like her. The email was short. Subject, proud. Ava, your mom would have wanted to see this. And I was wrong. You're doing more for aviation than I ever dreamed. If you'll let me, I'd like to visit the hangar someday. Dad. Ava stared at the screen. She didn't cry. She just exhaled. That night, she returned to the original hangar in Georgia, the same one where Skybridge was born. It still smelled like oil, victory, and grit. She ran her hand across the nose of her oldest jet and remembered the nights she slept in the back of it, working on business plans by flashlight and eating dollar noodles to conserve funds. She wasn't supposed to make it. She wasn't supposed to be here. But she was. Because when they laughed her out of Westland, they didn't realize she would build something bigger than a classroom. She'd build a fleet. And lead a generation. Summer rolled in with the roar of jet engines and opportunity. Ava's elevation program graduated its first cohort, a group of 20 diverse, fiercely capable young aviators, many of whom had never been on a plane before they applied. News stations covered the ceremony like a national event. Photos of black girls in aviator shades and hijabi teens in pilot uniforms spread across social media like wildfire. It wasn't just a program now. It was a movement. But with visibility came scrutiny. One morning, Ava's legal team alerted her to an op-ed published by a retired Westland trustee. The headline read, "Is Ava Sinclair using race to rewrite aviation standards?" The article was seething with coded language, calling her leadership emotional, her selections biased, and her funding redistribution a threat to tradition. It questioned whether standards were being lowered for the sake of optics and diversity. Ava read every word, then reread it. She didn't throw her laptop or pace the room. She simply picked up her phone and made 3 calls. First, to the FAA Compliance Board. Then, to her media strategist. Finally, to the one person who could help her pull off what she planned next, Rear Admiral Lorraine Hayes, the highest-ranking black woman in the U.S. Navy's Aviation Command. Within 10 days, Skybridge Global announced the Stratosphere Summit, a 2-day global aviation conference focused on innovation, inclusion, and the future of flight. Speakers included astronauts, combat veterans, commercial captains, engineers, and policy makers. Ava opened the event with a keynote that silenced every critic. "I've never lowered a standard," she said to a packed hall. "I've simply opened the cockpit door wider, so that talent, not tradition, becomes the gatekeeper." The applause was thunderous. Admiral Hayes followed her on stage and dropped the mic with one sentence. "If Sinclair ran the Navy, we'd have faster jets and fewer excuses." The article that tried to smear her? Buried under an avalanche of praise. But Ava wasn't interested in vindication. She was thinking about something else. Westland. Again. Despite everything, they still hadn't changed leadership. Dr. Langston's retirement had been announced, but not finalized. And rumors had started that the board was trying to bring in a safe successor. Someone with a pristine academic record, bland speeches, and the right background. Ava didn't want the job. She wanted the culture to change. So she made a bold move. She anonymously funded a Westland student project called Sky Without Borders, a joint simulation and flight test run by diverse cadets. And when the students won a national collegiate competition, they dedicated the trophy to a pilot who rose when others tried to keep her grounded. The board had no choice but to reach out again. Only this time they didn't ask Ava to speak. They asked her to consult. She agreed. With one condition. All flight instructors must be re-evaluated, including Dr. Langston. The board hesitated. Ava smiled. She already knew what came next. The re-evaluation process shook Westland Aviation Academy to its core. 4 years, instructors like Dr. Langston had operated with unchecked authority, protected by tenure, old money, and outdated metrics of success. But now, thanks to Ava Sinclair's conditional acceptance, Every instructor faced an unbiased FAA-led review, conducted under federal guidelines and monitored by a third-party ethics committee. Students whispered in hallways. Professors grew tense. Dr. Langston remained composed in public, but behind closed doors he fumed. "She's making a mockery of our institution," he hissed to a colleague. "This used to be about discipline and merit." But the numbers told a different story. When the evaluation team began interviewing students anonymously, a pattern emerged: biased grading, discriminatory remarks, resistance to change. The simulations showed that minority students, particularly women, were repeatedly assigned malfunctioning programs or penalized for minor infractions that others were allowed to slide by on. Even flight instructors admitted off the record that Langston ran things old school, and that a few cadets never got a fair shot. By the time the review wrapped, 5 faculty members were recommended for termination or reassignment. Dr. Langston was one of them. Ava received the findings with a sense of grim satisfaction, but she didn't gloat. Instead, she requested a private meeting with him before the board made its final decision. When he arrived at the conference room, he walked in with a rigid spine and tired eyes. "So," he said, folding his arms, "you get the last word." Ava looked at him evenly. "No. I got the last flight." He scoffed. "You think you've changed the game?" "I am the game now," she said softly but firmly. "You had a chance to shape the skies for everyone and you chose to clip wings instead. I'm not here to take your chair. I'm here to make sure no one like you ever sits in it again." He flinched. But Ava leaned in, voice calm. "You want legacy? Step down quietly. Let your resignation stand. Mentor the young pilots who still believe in the good you could have done. Or keep resisting and go down in disgrace. Either way, I'm not here to ruin you. I'm here to rebuild what you broke." Dr. Langston didn't answer. He simply stood, nodded stiffly, and left the room. Later that evening, the Academy issued a formal announcement. Dr. Gerald Langston had retired effective immediately, citing personal growth and institutional evolution. The next morning, Ava stood on the tarmac beside her jet, surrounded by students from both Westland and her Aviation program. Together they unveiled a new joint initiative, Horizons United, a collaborative training curriculum that merged elite standards with equity, innovation, and integrity. A young cadet approached Ava and held up a notebook. "Can you sign it?" she asked, eyes wide. Ava smiled, opened the cover, and wrote. "They tried to write me off. So I rewrote the skies. Captain A. Sinclair." The roar of an approaching jet overhead pulled everyone's gaze upward. For the first time in Westland's history, the sky belonged to everyone. The weeks following Dr. Langston's exit transformed Westland Aviation Academy in ways no one had imagined. Faculty meetings no longer echoed with arrogance and exclusion but with introspection. Mandatory cultural competency workshops were rolled out. Simulation software was upgraded with funds Ava herself had redirected through her federal oversight channels. Scholarships doubled, targeted specifically toward women, students of color, and first-generation aviators. But it wasn't just change within Westland. It was the ripple. Across the country, smaller flight schools that had once followed Westland's lead were now modeling themselves after Skybridge. Aviation blogs began referring to this Sinclair effect, the measurable rise in inclusion and performance metrics wherever her programs reached. Airlines took notice. In an unprecedented move, a major international carrier, Aerovista, offered Skybridge a joint venture to train and pipeline 500 new pilots over 3 years, all from historically underrepresented backgrounds. The deal was worth over $80 million. Ava didn't hesitate. She negotiated a clause that ensured Skybridge would hold final review over training completion, not Aerovista. It wasn't about money. It was about not letting history repeat itself. Still, amidst the triumph, something gnawed at her. She'd spent years rising through pain, exclusion, and systemic walls. Now she stood above it all, yet felt oddly unmoored. Her assistant, Monica, noticed. "Captain," she said one evening as they sat reviewing new regional maps, "you ever think about what's next for you?" Ava glanced up. "Skybridge is what's next." Monica leaned in. "You've created a fleet, a movement, a legacy. But maybe it's time you fly again. Not to prove anything. Just for you." The words settled into Ava's heart like a gentle storm. That night, she walked alone to the original Skybridge hangar. Inside sat her first plane, an old twin-engine turbo that had carried her through Haiti, Honduras, and heartbreak. She climbed into the cockpit, touched the controls, and closed her eyes. She didn't hear applause. She didn't hear critics. She just heard wind, power, altitude. The next morning, Ava filed a solo flight plan. She flew to her mother's grave in Montgomery, low and slow. Then circled over the Alabama countryside where her father had once dusted crops. Finally she soared high above Westland, banking once in a wide, perfect arc. From the ground, students looked up and saw the silhouette of a lone aircraft against the early morning sky. On its tail, the silver insignia of Skybridge. They didn't know it was her. They didn't need to. What mattered was that she flew. For herself. For the girl they laughed out of class. For every future pilot watching from below. The hum of the engines faded as Ava gently touched down on a private strip outside Atlanta. Her hands, still steady on the yoke, remained still for a long moment. She wasn't just landing a plane, she was arriving in a life she'd built from rejection, forged in silence and flown on faith. News of her solo flight trickled through aviation circles like folklore. Captain Sinclair took the sky alone again. No press releases. No camera crews. Just wings. But the quiet didn't last long. A week later, Ava received a call from the White House. Not a formality. Not a press stunt. A real invitation. The president, impressed by her work with underserved aviation students and Skybridge's role in U.S. relief efforts abroad, wanted to honor her with the Presidential Medal of Innovation in Transportation. Ava sat back in her chair, stunned for the first time in years. At the ceremony, dressed in an elegant navy suit with golden pilot wings pinned just above her heart, she stood next to generals, scientists, and entrepreneurs. But it was her story that drew the standing ovation. Even the president, mid-speech, paused and said, "Captain Sinclair reminds us that when the skies are closed to you, build your own runway." But Ava's heart wasn't with the cameras. It was back home in the hangar where change was still being built. One student, one engine, one unlikely dream at a time. Soon after the ceremony, she returned to her team with an idea. Not an expansion. A revolution. Airspace belongs to everyone, she began in a team meeting. So we're going to bring aviation to places that haven't even dreamed it. Thus, Skybridge Global launched Project Horizon, a mobile flight academy that would travel to rural communities, tribal lands, and inner cities, equipped with simulators, instructors, and ground training tools. Students who had never even seen an airplane up close could now sit in the cockpit, take controls, and imagine a different life. Within months, the first Horizon rig rolled into Mississippi. Ava personally gave the first flight lesson, to a quiet, wide-eyed girl named Nyla who couldn't stop staring at the buttons and screens. "Can I really do this?" Nyla whispered. Ava knelt beside her. "They told me I couldn't. They laughed when I walked into a classroom. But now, I walk into the sky." She placed Nyla's hand on the controls. "So yes, you can." Across the nation, hundreds of kids like Nyla were climbing into those mobile cockpits. Ava watched them all, remembering what it felt like to be unseen. Her phone buzzed again, another university requesting her to sit on their board. She didn't reply. Not yet. Because something else had caught her attention. A letter. Type. Signed. From Westland. Read. "Captain Sinclair. We would like to formally request your consideration in renaming our primary aviation hall. It has long borne the name of a founding trustee, but our students, faculty, and alumni have expressed unanimous interest in dedicating it to someone whose flight has truly changed the course of our institution. Will you permit us to name it the Ava Sinclair Flight Wing?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then she picked up a pen. Ava sat at her desk, the letter from Westland lying open before her. The weight of the offer didn't come from ego, it came from memory. She could still see that classroom where they laughed, hear the stifled snickers, feel the condescension in every ignored hand and every subtle dismissal. Now that same academy wanted to carve her name in stone. She picked up the pen, wrote 2 words, "I accept," and slid the letter back into the envelope. But she wasn't done. With it she included a clause of her own. The renaming would only move forward if Westland agreed to one final condition, that the Ava Sinclair Flight Wing would house a permanent scholarship center, reserved for underrepresented students with no legacy connections, no generational wealth, just raw potential. If her name would be etched into that building, it would be a door, not a pedestal. 3 weeks later, Westland agreed. On dedication day, the crowd overflowed the courtyard. News anchors gathered. Drones hovered above. Former students who once sat beside her, those who had mocked or ignored her, stood in the crowd with lowered eyes. As the curtain dropped and the silver letters gleamed against the marble facade, the Ava Sinclair Flight Wing, a slow, reverent applause built from the back until it filled the air like a jet breaking the sound barrier. Ava took the podium. "I once stood on this campus and was told without words that I did not belong, she said. But I never needed their permission. Just lift. She looked out into the faces of young cadets. Girls with braids and boys with stutters and dreams too big for their zip codes. Never forget, she said, voice steady. Flight doesn't come from approval. It comes from defiance, faith, and preparation. They tried to bury me. But I wasn't soil, I was a seed. And now, she extended her arm toward the building. This is the forest. Tears rolled down cheeks in the crowd. Even Dr. Langston, now retired, watching quietly from the back, lowered his head, hands clasped behind his back. As the crowd dispersed, Ava lingered behind, walking the halls of the wing that now bore her name. She ran her hand along the wall, pausing before a small plaque installed beside the main entry. Read. Dedicated to those who were laughed out, locked out, or left out, until they flew anyway. A soft voice interrupted her reflection. Captain Sinclair? She turned. It was Nyla, the girl from the mobile cockpit in Mississippi, now in full cadet uniform, her Skybridge insignia proudly displayed. I just got accepted here, she said. First in my family. I didn't think I could. But then, I read about you. Ava's smile was quiet. You didn't read about me, she said. You followed me. And with that, Ava handed Nyla a pair of golden wings from her own first uniform. Your turn to fly. In the end, this wasn't just a story about revenge or recognition. It was about legacy. Ava Sinclair didn't just break barriers. She rewrote the blueprint, turning her pain into purpose, her humiliation into history. Let her story be a reminder. Sometimes your greatest setback is just runway for something greater. As Ava once said, they tried to write me off, so I rewrote the skies. If you were inspired by this story, don't forget to subscribe to True Echo, leave us a comment with your favorite moment, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Your echo might be the spark someone else is waiting for.